Welcome to The Criminologist, the podcast dedicated to educating and entertaining our listeners. This week, bringing you a special American Probation and Parole Association edition. As the voice of the community corrections industry, APPA serves as the field's leading professional membership association. In addition to their U.S. members, the American Probation and Parole Association is supported by international members who are actively involved in strengthening community corrections work in their own countries. APPA's International Relations Committee aims to connect community corrections professionals around the world to inspire and share insights from their unique experiences and best practices. Welcome to this special APPA episode of The Criminologist. And now, welcome your host, Joseph Arvidson.
Hello, and welcome to episode 176 of The Criminologist Podcast. Happy to have you all with us today. The rich tapestry of our world sometimes unravels in the most unexpected places, and today we'll unravel such a story from down under. Born in the heart of Sydney, Australia, my next guest is a beacon of enlightenment in places some might consider desolate. Paul A. MacNamara has walked the corridors of several correctional centers in Australia, offering the transformative power of education. From seasoned inmates to young souls in the juvenile justice system, he's touched lives in ways most of us can only imagine. What's remarkable about Paul is that he ventured into this world without any political agenda or preconceived notions about the prison system. His book, The Criminal Class, Memoir of a Prison Teacher, is a riveting tale that oscillates between tragedy and amusement, the surreal and the stark realities, making for a read that's as entertaining as it is enlightening. Now, Paul brings a unique perspective to this special American Probation and Parole episode where we aim to shine a light on international connections around the world, highlighting how crime, justice, and rehabilitation can take shape in different corners of our globe. In a world where borders seem to be more prominent than bridges, it's these stories, like Paul's, that remind us of our shared humanity, of the universal truths that bind us, regardless of our geography or culture. Each episode in this special International Relations Committee series will venture into a different part of the world, exploring the intricate dance of crime, punishment, and redemption. Paul's journey in the Australian correctional system offers an invaluable lens into the complexities of its prison education framework, the challenges faced, and the triumphs celebrated. So, as we embark on this journey, delving into stories that span continents, cultures, and communities, I invite you to keep an open heart and mind. Let's discover, learn, and most importantly, connect. Joining us from the serene north coast of New South Wales, Australia, please enjoy my conversation with Paul MacNamara, and I will see you all on the other side. Well, welcome to the show, Paul, as noted, joining us all the way from Australia. We're going to talk all about your book, The Criminal Class, Memoir of a Prison Teacher. But before we dive into that, why don't you first introduce yourself to the audience, maybe tell them a little bit about your trajectory in life, in education, and sort of your life experiences. And then, as noted, we'll do a deeper dive on your book in a moment here. Welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks, Joe. My name's Paul MacNamara. I'm an author now. I am a teacher by trade. It wasn't my original trade when I grew up in Western Sydney. I sort of had ideas of becoming a rock and roller, which didn't quite pan out. And I used to work as a horticulturalist for a while, and I'm painting houses and doing a number of odd jobs until I sort of settled into a career in teaching. My first kind of role in teaching was teaching English as a second language to adult migrants in Sydney, which is a very multicultural city. So that was quite an enjoyable experience. And I did a degree in adult education to do that. And eventually that led me down the path to working in a prison. And I worked in the prisons in New South Wales in Australia. So I spent about 7 years working in the jails. And since then I've done 10 years working in juvenile justice in Australia. So I've done about 17 years inside now.
I always tell young people when I talk to them, Paul, whether it's in a formal set or even informal, is there are so many pathways that your lives are going to take professionally, vocationally, and that's a great illustration of the sort of zigzag path that life just hands us sometimes. You mentioned your desire to be an aspiring rock and roller. When I think of Australian rock and roll, I go right to AC/DC or In Excess. Were you in either of those camps, Paul?
Probably more in the In Excess camp, and bands like Midnight Oil, another famous Aussie band. When I was sort of in that scene in the late 80s, there was quite a vibrant music scene in Australia. So, it seemed like a viable path. And, I grew up in a working class neighborhood, and some people saw ways out like doing music, and, some people even saw crime as a way out. So it was interesting how that sort of married as well.
Well, great segue to your book, The Criminal Class, Memoir of a Prison Teacher. It sounds absolutely riveting. I have some experience working in correctional facilities, so am familiar that, yes, correctional facilities have embedded teachers, for lack of a better term, teaching those incarcerated individuals. Tell us what drew you to teaching within the prison system initially. You mentioned teaching, but I'm sure that wasn't at the top of your list of one day I want to teach in a correctional setting.
Yeah, no, that wasn't a goal of mine. Actually, until I went for the position, I didn't even realize, as you say, that they actually had education in prisons. I hadn't really given prisons too much thought at all about what goes on inside there. And even when I went for the position, I had no idea what kind of educational role it would be within it. When I had my eldest daughter, I took a year off work and was a house husband. And when that year was up, I started looking for positions as a teacher. And there was a position that came up in the corrections in Australia. And I just thought I'd have a look. I went for a number of jobs and I had a look at that one. And I got called in for an interview. And that's how it started, really. It wasn't any planned desire of mine. But once I actually saw what it was, I thought I'd give it a go and try it out. And as I said, I ended up doing 7 years in there.
Most folks have a perception of what it's like inside of a prison. I remember my first day working in a correctional facility and all the perceptions I brought with me. I did review your book a little bit and describe the sort of first day on the job, that first encounter that you had in a jail classroom, and how that really reshaped your perception and approaches and subsequent interactions working with those individuals in the correctional setting.
Yeah, well, Joe, I suppose the thing was that when you first turn up at a jail and, you see the razor wire and the large fences and the boom gates and the guards, and in Australia, like in America, we still have towers with guards in there with guns. So it's quite confronting when you first get there. And then I've described in the book as well that there are all these ways of getting in. So you walk through one door and that door locks behind you before the next one will open. And it sort of reminded me of the end of the old TV show
Exactly.
Get Smart. And so it's sort of a sensory overload on your first day. And then when you get into the inner sanctum, then you see all the prisoners, on the yard and the guards walking around, and you realize you are somewhere else. That very first day in the classroom was, I describe in the book that I'm sitting in a room with an armed robber, or a murderer, a rapist, and each of them has a potential weapon, which was, they have a pen or a pencil. And I sat there at the teacher's desk. You have a duress alarm button on the wall that you can push. You look out the window. Again, you can see over to the yard, and you can see the razor wire. And you look across at the door and you think, if something goes wrong here, will I be able to get out in time? And, you realize it's probably not a very good chance of getting out in time. And so it is, I remember trying to play it cool, but I could actually feel a bead of sweat running down the front of my shirt in that very first classroom. And then one of the big guys in front of me put his hand up and asked me if I could help him with his writing. And then it sort of broke down again to that teacher-student relationship, and all that background sort of noise falls away, and you realize that, you're there to help people, and there's people who actually need your help, and that student-teacher thing kicks in.
I love that you fell back on sort of your foundational teacher perspective, that teacher-student relationship. Along those lines, Paul, I'm wondering, did your teaching methodologies change, if at all, when transitioning from a traditional classroom to a prison setting classroom?
Yeah, they did, because the whole setting is quite different. Like I was saying, with the locked doors and the duress buttons, we eventually ended up having two-way radios that were attached to your belt. We had lanyards with keys attached to it. Every door had to be opened and closed. In the classroom itself, we had inventories where you couldn't just give out pens randomly to people. People can turn those into weapons. They can turn them into syringes. Everything that came out had to be accounted for. So there were a number of challenges. There was limited computer access. I remember when I first started there, I was amazed that there was a guy who was doing a university course facilitated through our education, but he was handwriting assignments, and he would bring them up, and we'd look at those assignments as he was writing them, but in pen and paper. And this was only less than 20 years ago. They have more access to computers now, but the internet and Wi-Fi, things like that, are frowned upon because they can be used for evil instead of good. But yeah, so as a teacher, you had to sort of work within those constraints, and there was a lot of, I suppose, it's set up like the old-fashioned way, so it's like a lot of teacher-centered instruction, almost that talk and chalk kind of thing. I incorporated a lot of my ESL training into that, English as a Second Language training, so I did a lot of warmers and group work kind of activities, which at first I think the prisoners found quite strange, but then they sort of get used to that. And I suppose the other thing in education in correctional settings was it's very personalized, because some people were basically illiterate. Others were doing university degrees. Some, people could hardly speak English. There was a whole range, diverse needs. And the other thing was that a lot of the jails in Australia, like I suppose around the world, are working jails. So they have industries within them. And it used to be my job as well to teach basic computer skills to the industry's clerks, as they called them, who were working for the industry overseers, and they would be doing databases, Excel spreadsheets. So, you had that range of needs, and even things like, it was quite strange. I would have people who would be receiving letters from home and couldn't read them, and would come up and would want to learn how to read a letter and would want to know how to write a letter back. And one thing that struck me was I remember a guy who must have been about 50 years old at the time, and he came and saw me and he said, "I'm doing 8 years inside and I'd like to be able to read a newspaper while I'm here." So just the needs within education just meant that your methodologies had to just suit your clients, really.
That story you tell of individuals wanting to write letters home or read the newspaper reminds me of something that I know most people in corrections, probation, parole experiences. Once they get past the offense, or in your case, the sort of unique contextual settings of a correctional facility, they start to humanize that person and see the humanity and the vulnerability and that type of thing. Did that come as a surprise to you, Paul, when you first started to develop those relationships with your students, that they were more than just their offense?
Yeah, that's right. And I suppose, when we were talking earlier about my first impressions of prisons was, from the TV and movies, you see that someone commits a crime, the cops chase them, the cops catch them, they put them away, that's the end of the story. And once you start working in corrections, you realize it's not the end of the story. It's just another chapter. And, what do you do with that person? And someone, once said to me quite wisely a while ago in my teaching career that teaching is all about building relationships. And what I found was that, I wasn't there as the judge. I wasn't there as a guard. My role was different. And so what I had to do was look at that person in a different way as a person and figure out what can I actually do to help them along the way. And that was sort of the basis of my teaching pathway, really, in corrections. We even had things like you have commissaries, you call it in America, and over in Australia we call that a buy-up, where prisoners can buy goods after they've worked. They earn a certain amount of money and then they can buy things. We had guys who were in that situation, but, were basically innumerate. And, I would take that buy-up sheet, as it was called, or like a commissary list. And, we would do numeracy lessons based on that, where they would figure out the value of the goods they were buying. And, you would just sort of relate your teaching back to that and what they needed.
You mentioned that you equated teaching to really boiling down to relationships. It reminded me of something that I'm always telling folks in the probation, parole, corrections sphere, is that at the end of the day, for any of our evidence-based practices, core correctional skills to take hold, we first have to establish that working alliance. And so just as teaching sometimes boils down to establishing relationships, it's the same with supervision in corrections. It boils down to establish those relationships. But as we know, that's sometimes easier said than done. You mentioned in your book, threading the, quote, rocky path of an outsider on the inside. Can you talk about some of the challenges in establishing those relationships and establishing your identity and your authority in, again, somewhat of a unique setting?
Yeah, well, I suppose the first thing I noticed was in the States, prisoners wear orange, mainly from what I can tell. And over in Australia, prisoners wear green and the custodial officers wear blue. And there was very much a blue versus green dynamic throughout the whole place. And as a teacher, you were wearing civilian clothes, and you were, your allegiance was to neither, really. The guards were friendly enough to you, but you weren't part of their team. And as well, you weren't one of the guys in green. So it was quite an interesting dynamic to be this person who sort of goes in between the two different settings, and how you navigate that. The prisoners had a view of education that it wasn't number one on their list. If you went down, sometimes we would go down to the accommodation units, or the wings as they call them in the jails here, and prisoners would come running to you thinking that you were from parole, or that you were a counsellor, or and then when you told them that you were from education, people would back away. So to the prisoners, education wasn't number one. And as well for the guards, education was seen as a diversion, a way for prisoners to get out of doing work. There wasn't really a lot of value placed in what education could do. If somebody had a job within the jail and they also had a class that clashed, because there's all that competing, there's all the different programs that are offered, and you're grabbing people at different times, and the correctional people weren't very happy if someone was going to education and not going to work, and they couldn't see the long-term benefit of that. So, you did sort of walk that pathway, and education's not a core business within corrections. So it's sort of given lip service at a higher level, but I wouldn't say it's given the regard it's probably due. And so you did have a strange position that you were in within that setting.
For what it's worth, Paul, that's my experience here as well in the States. Definitely in the facilities have that, as you put it, blue versus green, or us versus them, whatever. But then, there are also certain staff members that were in this quasi role of either education or, for example, we have embedded medical nurses working in the facilities, or even administrative staff, counselors, caseworkers that didn't fit into that weren't pigeonholed into one of those blue versus green or us versus them, sort of had to find their way and establish those unique relationships with both camps. Are there any particular stories or inmates that left a lasting impression, or maybe even change your perceptions about crime and rehabilitation?
So I had quite a number of different people in mind. There was one guy who was getting into a lot of trouble in the correctional setting, and he was about to be regressed to another jail. They would do that if they weren't following the good order of the centre, as they called it. And this guy was a Sudanese refugee to Australia. He was from an armed robbery gang. He had quite a violent past, and he seemed to be not following the orders. The guards regarded him as recalcitrant. He came to education, and they said to me, if you don't do something with this guy, he's going. So anyway, I sat down and spoke with this guy. He was always getting in trouble for not being anywhere on time. And once I'd done some assessments with him, I realized that he was basically illiterate and innumerate in English, as he was in his first language. His history was that he'd gone from Sudan. The civil war was on there. He then lived from a toddler to, early teen years in an Egyptian refugee camp. Eventually came to Australia, was feeling isolated in school, and a gang took him on, and that's where he found some camaraderie, and he got involved in this armed robbery gang. And here we were, people getting angry at him for not being somewhere on time. And then once I'd done some work with him, realised he couldn't read a clock. So it was no wonder. So you have those kind of stories, and then, you could change his ways. When we sort of worked with each other, he eventually wrote a letter to his younger brother asking him not to follow in his pathway and to support the mother. So that was gave me some idea. The other part, I suppose, really is that you go in there not so much as a do-gooder, but you do have this idea that you can transform things. And one classic case for me that really sticks in my head was I had an inmate who was doing university course facilitated through our education unit. He was quite close to the end of that, and one day he didn't turn up to education, and I rang the wings, the accommodation unit, to ask what's going on with this fella, and they said he's locked up in confinement. And I found out that he'd seriously assaulted somebody in the wing. And I remember at first my reaction was, he's so close to a degree, he's so close to getting out. He's now assaulted someone. There's going to be further police charges. He's going to be regressed to another jail. His course won't complete. We were this close. Why would you risk all that? And just before he was sent to another jail, he came up to education to see me. And he said to me, I'm near the end of my sentence. He said, a couple of mates from my gang turned up to visits, and they told me, the gang, want you to get back. We've got a brand new Mercedes-Benz waiting for you. Things are going to be all right. We're going to look after you. Get back. Don't worry about this other pathway. And then when he went back down into the wings, a new prisoner had arrived, and that prisoner had decided he was going to fight someone to show that he was no pushover, and he picked this guy that I knew. And the prisoner said to me, you can't not back down from that. If you back down from that, you're a target. And he said, I had to do what I had to do. And he said to me, Paul, for all the good that you're doing, and I appreciate it, he said, you don't know what it's like to live down there. You don't know what it's like once they lock the gate. And you don't want to know what it's like to be down there. And that was a story for me really about, what we can do as far as rehabilitation goes, but there's so many other competing forces than just education.
It reminds me of a story that a guest just a few weeks back told me about Tim Chapman from Northern Ireland. I asked him in his previous role as a probation officer, he's more in academia now, but did he have any moments of, if I knew then what I knew now type thing? And he said he was delivering cognitive behavioral interventions to high-risk individuals, and at one point, one of his clients said to him, Tim, that's all fine and well, but you don't live on my street. In other words, you don't understand the context of what it's like to apply these skills beyond the chalkboard or beyond how it looks on paper, so to speak. And that's one of the things that I'm always trying to do on the show is share some of that perspective, because I think there's so much value in perspective taking, as you just illustrated with that story. Somebody without that perspective, without your perspective, might just look at that as a statistical blip. Somebody reoffended. It's recidivism. It's relapse. It's whatever. Yeah. But it's not just data on an Excel spreadsheet. It's someone's life, and you just did a great job of really filling in so much more of that person's experience and getting folks to understand his perspective and his decision making. Or as he was saying, you don't live down here, Paul. You don't know what it's like. And yeah, we don't. Those of us coming from pro-social backgrounds, with pro-social perspectives. So that's one thing that I'm always trying to do on the show here. I do know that humor seems to play a role in your narrative, Paul. How important was humor in sort of navigating and coping with the challenges of teaching in prison?
Yeah, humor was vital because the whole prison experience is quite surreal. You see and you hear of some truly awful things, some awful crimes. You're confronted on a daily basis with the effects of long-term drug and alcohol addiction, extremes in mental health. It's sort of like sad story after sad story, and it can be quite, wear you down. It does take its toll, and one thing I sort of noticed when I began was how the guards who had been there for 20-odd years, they become hardened to that. The criminals become hardened to it as well. Everybody's seen it all. So a sense of perspective and a sense of humour was sort of vital through getting through that. And you do hear all these horror stories, but there's also some, really hilarious situations that go on inside such a strange setting. I relate a couple of stories in the book. One I remember was they do have this big, what they call a cook and chill area, where they provide all the meals for the jails across the state, and they have these big vats, with big ladles where they're making all kinds of vegetables and soups, and so the prisoners work in there, and what happened was meat started disappearing, the steaks were disappearing, and the guards were trying to figure out, they'd be monitoring people as they left, and they couldn't see anything, and they were wondering what was happening, And one day they lined everybody up, and they just decided they were going to strip search everybody. So everyone was naked. They're all standing there. This is like at a big hospitality place, so it's quite strange thing to see, and everyone's lined up, and there's one guy, and he's still standing in his shoes, but he's completely naked, and eventually they coax him to take his shoes off as well, and inside his shoes were 2 steaks. The prisoners were standing on the steaks all day working on them, and then they would bring them back to the wings, because in certain areas you could cook your own meals once you'd got to a certain classification, and the steaks were of high value within the accommodation wings. So these steaks were disappearing that had been seasoned by people's feet, and you couldn't make those kind of stories up. And another one that I actually found quite funny was, they had an external work program, and as I said, the prisoners wear green in Australia, and they used to do community work in public gardens and parks. And one time they went out, and there was 11 of them, and when they came back, there was 12. So some old guy was working in his garden right next to the park, and he was wearing his old green clothes to do his gardening, and the guards just chucked him in the van with everybody else. He was protesting his innocence, and of course everybody in the van were protesting their innocence as well. And it wasn't until they came back and did a head count, and the senior officer was saying, I've heard of coming back with one less, but not with one more.
What a great story, Paul. When you told the steak story, it reminded me. Let me ask you if you ever experienced this phenomenon in the facility you worked in. But did you ever have individuals volunteer to work in the kitchen, because that gave them access to, among other things, fruits and vegetables, which they would then steal the fruit to bring back to their cells to make what we call hooch here in the United States, but sort of the home brew.
Yeah.
But that was a big motivation for folks to volunteer to work in the kitchen, was access to the fruit to get that vital supply to make their in jail made alcohol.
Yeah, and that was a strange thing I noticed early on as well, was sugar's scarce inside the jail. So they had artificial sweeteners, but they wouldn't have sugar. And that was because the prisoners would do that. They'd grab a couple of oranges or apples, put some water in, put some sugar into a plastic bag, and they might tie it to a tree within the jail and leave it there in the sun to brew. And yeah, as you said, that becomes the hooch that is in high demand as well over there.
It was amazing to see the creativity and the innovation. I'm sure you and I could compare notes and go on and on. But for example, I was surprised, I shouldn't have been, but when I saw that people were taking their sandals, their sort of shower sandals, what I'm talking about. We call them flip-flops sometimes here in the States, but they were using those to create cribbage boards and drilling out the sandal to make cribbage boards and using other creative things to use for the pegs. But I could go on and on about if you give someone enough time and their ingenuity is going to kick in, that's for sure.
Yeah, and that was a thing they did warn us of as well, is that the prisoners have so much time on their hands that they're thinking of so many things to do. And that was, as well, they'd warn us about something called officer shopping, where they would go from one person to the next and they'd ask for something. And if you did give them something that maybe they weren't supposed to have, then they would work out, okay, this is someone that we can leverage.
I mentioned perspective taking earlier. How has your perspective on the criminal justice system evolved during your time as an education officer in the prison?
Yeah, well, my perspective is I still don't think, from my view, that we've really worked out what we want to do with prisons. There's always this punishment versus rehabilitation, and how much of this we do, how much of the other we do, what is the balance. And, the idea is that prisons are there to take the bad people out of society, to keep the wolves from the door. And I remember part of my training was they would take you to the courts, and I remember a judge saying, that the court's role is to balance making a sentence long enough to deter someone from committing the same offence, but not too long to make the prisoner an even more dysfunctional person. And I think that balance is the trick that everybody probably struggles with. And some of the things I've thought about and tried to sort of illustrate in the book is that once you get all your bad eggs and you put them into the one basket, into that one setting, what are you hoping is going to be the end product of that? Like how many pro-social role models is a young inmate going to find in a prison? And I suppose that was, as an educator, that was my role, to sort of maybe model that in a way and show there wasn't another way out. But yeah, I think until that's sort of figured out what we really want to do, and it seems to be cyclical in Australia anyway, and probably around the world, is, when an election comes up, we're going to be tough on crime, we're going to chuck people away. But once you actually work in there, you do realise these people are going back into society, maybe in 2 years, in 4 years, whatever it is. And what do you want them to be when they get out? And how do you stop them from being worse than when they went in? We have poor recidivism rates in Australia, like you do in the States as well. I know from working in juvenile justice, for example, that if you go into juvenile justice, there's roughly 70% chance that you'll be back again. And then there's a 50% chance that you will graduate to the big house, as we call it. So, you think if that was a business you were trying to, get off the ground, would you be investing in that business model?
You just validated what I've been trying to tell stakeholders forever about the use of incarceration, and that's that tricky balance that you just articulated. We know on the one hand that, yes, we have a responsibility to protect the public and take dangerous individuals out of society, but we have to realize that incarceration in and of itself is riddled with risk factors, what we call criminogenic factors. So
yeah,
I often use, and I stole it from somebody a lot smarter than me, but it's almost sort of the chemotherapy argument with cancer patients. If you don't strike that right balance, not enough chemotherapy, the cancer is going to get you. Too much chemo, you're going to die of the chemotherapy. You have to strike that balance. Like you said, these individuals are going to get out. That's one of the things I really applaud the folks in Norway who are a lot further evolved in this than we are, is that they realize these folks are getting out. Their mantra over there and how they train their staff are, all of these individuals are going to be your neighbor someday. So treat them like they're going to be your next door neighbor when they get out in a year or 5 years or 10 years or 20 years. And it gives a whole new perspective on trying to strike that balance between protection and rehabilitation. Paul, what do you hope the readers will take away from your book, especially those who have little knowledge of life behind bars?
Yeah, well, I suppose the one thing I'm hoping is that people will view the book like my eyes in it, going in there, having no experience of it. For a reader, then you can see it through my eyes. I was told early on when I was thinking of getting published, someone was saying you should change the narrative of the story where the education officer foils a riot and becomes the hero of this story. And I thought, yeah, that's okay for a Hollywood kind of show maybe, but at the same time, I thought the whole thing was interesting enough itself, just in how it really is. And I just wanted to, I suppose, with that whole argument of rehabilitation and punishment, is if you shine light on the whole system, then people can make a judgment on that, because the people who are reading it are the taxpayers, and the taxpayers are the ones who are paying for it. One thing that was confronting to me being within the system is there's this code of silence that goes along with it. I remember when we were training one time and there was talk about the methadone program. I'm not sure if you have that in the States, but we have it here as a way to wean people off opioid addiction. And I remember raising a question about it when I was doing my training and saying, how is it monitored? Can you just put your hand up and say, I was on drugs on the outside, and then I can sort of cruise through my sentence, stoned basically. And instead of being given an answer about it, I was told, you cannot take stories like this to the press. If any of this is mentioned anywhere, you will be, held to account for this. And I was, the taxpayer again pays for that program. I think they're valid questions. I wasn't condemning the program or for the program. I was only asking a question, but I kept running up against this sort of code of silence. Whereas I think, through the book, I'm giving a view of the picture of the prison system from my view anyway, of what it was actually like. I think it's authentic. I may not have all the answers, but I think I raise some valid questions. And the feedback I've been getting from people is that, they're finding it insightful and thought-provoking, as well as humorous and entertaining. So, I don't see myself as an academic on these kind of matters. I know some of it from being within it, but my role maybe is more as a storyteller, I suppose.
Well, for listeners who have become sufficiently curious to seek out your book, I will leave a link for how to purchase that book in the episode description of this podcast. Hey, Paul, finally, for perhaps a listener or an educator who might be considering teaching in a similar environment, What advice or insights would you offer?
Well, it's interesting because after I did finish in education in the prison system in Australia, in New South Wales, the state of Australia, they ended up getting rid of teachers from there. It was a cost-cutting exercise by a government that came in. They still haven't replaced them. So hopefully there will be some teachers I might be able to give some advice to in the future. But as I said, I suppose it's all really about building relationships. It's a very challenging workplace, but it's also can be quite rewarding. You do run up against a lot of obstacles, but you can also turn someone's life around. All that idea of that you can plant a seed in someone's head that there are alternatives to that kind of future, that it's not compulsory to come back. There are other ways. I suppose as a teacher, sometimes you may be that person's last chance, at changing their life. And that's quite a rewarding position to be in.
I often tell practitioners, Paul, regardless of their role, but to your point, don't underestimate every interaction you have with a justice-involved individual could be that touch point, that data point that changes their trajectory more than an off-the-shelf cognitive behavioral intervention or a methadone program or these other sort of established approaches, which are valid. But as I said, I think sometimes the individual underestimates that they might touch that person in a certain way or share a perspective or just be a good listener and alter that person's trajectory down a pathway towards desistance from crime.
Yeah, Joe, I remember one time in youth justice in particular, there was an inmate who was leaving, and when he was leaving, he gave me a hug as he left, and he did say to me that the first time I was in your class, I wanted to crack a chair over your head. So that's progress.
That's progress. Exactly. Paul MacNamara, author of the book, The Criminal Class, Memoir of a Prison Teacher. Thank you so much for joining us, Paul. I hope to have you back on the program someday. And until then, be well, my friend.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. And I hope to see you in Australia.
Yes, I'll be there in October. Hopefully we can connect. All right. Be well, Paul. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
As the pages turn on Paul MacNamara's life and the chapters of his book unfold, we come to realize the vast layers and depth that exist behind the formidable walls of a prison. The environment, often perceived as stark, holds stories, lessons, and moments that challenge our very understanding of humanity, rehabilitation, and resilience. When Paul first stepped into that prison classroom, he wasn't just transitioning spaces, he was transcending worlds. The initial intensity, the apprehension, they are all palpable reminders of the real challenges that educators in such environments face. But what's compelling is not the fear or the inherent dangers, but the sheer will and motivation to continue, to make a difference, even when the path seems inundated with hurdles. Paul's journey showcases that teaching within prison walls isn't merely about shifting methodologies. It's about adapting, understanding, and connecting on a level that goes beyond textbooks and curricula. The moments of vulnerability, the surprising glimpses of humanity that surfaced in his interactions with inmates, are testaments to the fact that there's more to every individual than the mistakes they've made. However, the challenges weren't solely about navigating inmate relations. As Paul described, threading the rocky path of an outsider on the inside also meant grappling with one's identity and authority. The dance of relationships with correctional officers, forming both tensions and alliances, is indicative of the multifaceted dynamics in such an environment. Stories that linger, moments that redefine perceptions, and encounters that changed trajectories. Paul's time as an education officer was filled with these. And while humor played its part in offering relief, it also showcased the ubiquitousness of laughter and its ability to bridge even the most daunting divides. Today, as we reflect on the evolution of Paul's perspective on the criminal justice system, it's imperative to acknowledge that these aren't just Paul's lessons, they are lessons for all of us. They are about hope, understanding, and most importantly, about the power of education in places where it is needed the most. For those educators considering embarking on a similar path, Paul's insights are not just recommendations, they are beacons of light. As we close today's episode, I'd like to express my profound gratitude to the International Relations Committee of the American Probation and Parole Association. Their support has been instrumental in bringing forth these powerful narratives that remind us of the threads of connection that span across countries, cultures, and communities. These stories are not just about understanding crime and rehabilitation in different parts of the world. They are about understanding ourselves a little better, one story at a time. Listeners, whether you're familiar with life behind bars or not, Paul's memoir offers a mirror to society, reflecting both its imperfections and its possibilities. It serves as a reminder that even within confines, the human spirit can soar, learn, and transform. Thank you for joining us today on this special episode of the Criminologist Podcast. Remember, there's always more to the story than meets the eye. And as we keep delving deeper, let's stay connected, compassionate, and curious. Back next week with a fresh episode. In the meantime, you may contact the show or reach out to us through our website, theparagongroup.llc.com, for training or presentations as to core correctional skills, program design, or of course, the topic of desistance from crime. If you have questions or comments as to this podcast, feel free to contact the show via our email at thecriminologistpodcast@gmail.com. That's thecriminologistpodcast@gmail.com. Remember to follow us through our Facebook and Instagram pages at The Criminologist Podcast. New, fun images are being added all the time to those feeds. You don't want to miss out. The Criminologist Media Group is also on Twitter. Give us a follow at Crim Media Group. That's CRIM Media Group. You may also connect with me, Joseph Arvidson, on LinkedIn, and follow both the Criminologist Podcast and the Paragon Group on our LinkedIn pages. Hey, lastly, if you've not already done so, check out and subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Criminologist, for additional content as to the themes of this program. And if you believe in what we're doing on the program, if you're part of the movement, please spread the word. Tell a friend or a coworker or a colleague about us. Ask them to subscribe to the podcast, and do so yourself if you've not already done so. And always remember, folks, there's no them, there's only us.
From the TV and movies, you see that someone commits a crime. The cops chase them, the cops catch them, they put them away. That's the end of the story. And once you start working in corrections, you realize it's not the end of the story. It's just another chapter.
This has been a special APPA edition of the Criminologist Podcast. Their international relations team looks forward to sharing the insights of other subject matter experts from around the world in future episodes. The Criminologist Podcast is a production of the Paragon Group, LLC. For speaking engagements, interviews, program design, or training opportunities, please visit us at theparagongroup.llc.com. Be sure to give us a 5-star review, and thanks for listening.